Gentlemen, welcome to the Progressive American Report. I'm your host, Connor Kelly. Today I'm sitting with Dr. Ann Ishimaru and Dr. Decoteau Irby, and we're going to be discussing the importance of equity leadership in education. They are the co-authors of Doing the Work of Equity Leadership for Justice and Systems Change, which examines the pursuit of justice inside school systems during an era of racial violence, organized opposition, and white supremacy. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks so much for having us.
My pleasure. So to start out rather simple, I wanted to get the background that kind of influenced both you two meeting to create this work and also what inspired you in your academic and personal careers to pursue this work and why is it so important in America today?
That's a lot of questions. Okay, well, maybe I'll get us. I'll start with a little bit about who I am and how we came together, and then maybe Decoteau, you could pick it up from there with who you are and sort of the story of the book. So I'm Ann Ishimaru. I am a scholar, a researcher, writer, mom, and also a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle at the College of Education. And I teach in programs that are supporting folks in becoming practitioners and policymakers, but also researchers and educational leaders. And so my work has really focused on the leadership of young people, families, and communities, especially from minoritized communities, as well as the leadership of educators in educational systems, always focused around how those who've been impacted by educational injustices are taking up their agency and leadership in making change to ensure the success and well-being of young people who have experienced a variety of different injustices and inequities, both in the system and without. So, and that's kind of a lifelong pursuit for me. And one of the things that got us started in terms of the conversation that has resulted in this book was around 2016, I think. I was gathering with some fellow scholars convened by Muhammad Khalifa, who's another terrific scholar. And we were having lunch, just a conversation and talking about what was going on in our own networks. And we started to notice that there were a lot of folks who were gaining this role of equity director in different parts of the country. So I'm in Seattle, Dakota's in Chicago. Our colleague, Dr. Terrence Green, is in Texas, and started to realize that more and more school districts, we had already seen this in higher education, were bringing people into this official role to try to lead, to make changes to our systems to make them more equitable.
Wonderful. And Dr. Irby, what was one of the bigger inspirations for you joining in on this project? What was your background and how it really affected you personally? Why did you think it was so important for the nation to have this kind of work available? And really, how has the reaction to the book really affected both of your work and really yours personally?
Yeah, thank you. And forgive me, I missed some of Ann's explanation because I cut out for a minute, so I'm not going to be redundant. But thank you again for having me on. My name, again, is Decoteau Irby. I'm a father. I like to always start with that. I have a 10-year-old who are in public schools here in Chicago. I'm also a professor of educational policy studies at University of Illinois, Chicago. I'm a native of the South. I grew up in South Carolina. I've lived in multiple places: Philadelphia, San Francisco, Milwaukee, and now Chicago is the place I call home. I think that there's kind of three things that have kind of really driven my scholarship and my interest in the kind of work that we're doing. First is the importance of struggle, and that struggle is necessary to make progress. Progress is possible with struggle. And finally, that equity and justice is imperative, and we keep commitments to equity and justice at the center of everything we do. Ann and my colleague Terrence share a lot of those same kind of commitments. They're people who push me intellectually to think about issues of struggle, to question what progress means, even though I do believe progress is possible. So the lunch conversation that we had several years ago is what really led us into exploring this book. And we started, before this current moment, really thinking about Trayvon Martin, thinking about the rise in commitments to do something different that came about after George Zimmerman was acquitted of the fatal shooting of Trayvon Martin. And that's where we saw the rise actually of the Million Hoodies movement. That's when we first got the tag of Black Lives Matter, even though it didn't take off until much later. Ferguson happened. So there were all of these flashpoints building around these, shootings of Black people and of, people of color. So this kind of like, state violence against Black bodies, which is not new. But one of the things that was unique about this particular moment in which equity leaders started to more deeply engage in the work in districts within district systems was that these were instances where we had, for example, a 911 call that people listened to. This is when we would see things put on the television, things put on the, social media, once social media started to become more prominent. And so all of a sudden you had a situation where a combination of, the request for release of, audio and information on the one hand, and on the other hand, everyday people being able to take up media in a more kind of democratic way and actually show what's happening, that actually compelled people to start thinking more about what should be done. And we organized the book in some ways around that beginning point, and then led up to the current moment. We were supposed to turn the book into the publisher in November of 2024. We're academics, so we were late. That ended up working out in our favor because, Donald Trump was elected to his second term as president of the United States. And that the fact that we were a little late getting the book to the publishers gave us the opportunity to really think about what we learned over almost a decade of research meant for this current moment now. And that's when we reframed the book's significance, not only as learning about what equity leadership entails, but also thinking about documenting the work that people have done in response to the kinds of violence that we've seen over the years, and making sure that the work that people have done is not erased.
Perfect. And it does sound to me like this was very much like a almost grassroots academia like approach that I would describe it as. But the other side of this is you mentioned Trayvon Martin, Dr. Irby, and the acquittal of his killer. I think the thing that is especially pertinent to me here is we're not just talking about education as an abstract teaching moment or as a teaching institution, but we're talking about it as a matter of our relationship to the state, to our government, to our democracy. Insofar as the reaction to Trayvon Martin's death and then subsequently the officer's acquittal, or the acquittal, how has that political violence influenced not only your approach to this book, but also how you've interacted with other media figures talking about it, trying to inform people of the significance of anti-Black violence, and really how has that impact played a role in just how you've interacted with the backlash? I know both you mentioned the Tea Party reaction to the Obama administration's attempts to deal with unequal treatment. But could you go into a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can. I'm happy to get us
Yes.
started. So,
Let's start.
yeah, I part of it is, we do work primarily as as academics, right? As researchers, as people who have a commitment to conducting systematic inquiry to understand, new phenomena that we explore in this book is, what we call equity leadership, formal equity leadership. So people who are engaged in formal roles and informal positions to engage in trying to make school systems better. And yes, were important points, but one of the ways that the geography of racial violence has really shaped some of our research specifically is that there were areas in the South that we weren't able to actually get to consent to participate in our project. So our book and what we've learned is large part, what we've written about is in large part comes from places that are more democratic leaning politically, and that many of the districts and the school sites that we work with have more progressive ideas about what should be happening in schools than, say, for example, my home state of South Carolina or Georgia, which is where, Trayvon Martin was killed when he was in Georgia. So there's these regional differences that we see. And it's been interesting because we've had the opportunity since we released the book to talk to people in different regions in different parts of the country. And one of the things that I've realized is that the conversation is very different in different parts of the country. Even the questions that folks are asking are very different. The questions that you ask are very different than the questions that people in the South would ask. In the South, some of the questions are in certain areas of the country. Many of the questions are about, this idea of like, what do we do in the face of the kind of like, this state kind of, repression of books, of, the rollback, and not even only a rollback, a hostility towards LGBTQIA people and their rights, a hostility towards immigrants, a hostility towards, Black people, right? And so it's been interesting to see how they are thinking about, and in certain areas, people are thinking about, what do we do? Because it's not really an option necessarily of whether we, I guess the political moment that we're in right now already started in certain areas of the country is the easiest way to say it, right? So they're already thinking about they've already changed how they talk about justice work and equity work, right? Many of those places have already conceded and said that, we can't read these particular sets of books. This is the law now. This is how teachers have to move now. And so there's other places that are different. Anne lives in Seattle. If you think about places like California, if we think about recently what happened in Minnesota, if we think about Illinois and Chicago, we have a kind of, I would say, a much more expansive and robust set of options in front of us in terms of like, what do we do in a current moment like now? Than in some places where their conversations are really trying to figure out, how do we pivot work? How do we move the work? Whereas in places like Chicago, some of the questions is like, do we double down on what we've been doing, which Chicago Public Schools has, or do we concede some things, and what are the benefits or the detriments of doing the other? And so those begin to be, it's a different set of conversations happening in different places around the country.
Yeah, and
which really relates though to the kind of theme of the book. So just to kind of jump in there and add to that, is like, if you look at the cover of the book, we've got this sort of morning on the top, like brighter midday and then evening. And so that's, we kind of have looked across this time period, and we're saying, yes, there is variability in terms of the possibilities and constraints for leadership in different geographies, but there's also a kind of social political context that's shifting, and, we're in night now.
Yeah, and I think that the other side of this, and this is where I think it's helpful that we have both of you here, because you're like Dr. Irby's in Chicago, Dr. Ishimaru, you're in Seattle, like Dr. Irby mentioned. Were some of the differences in just location impacting the way in which both of you looked at your perspectives? Did it impact the way you approached your analysis, your research, and to Dr. Irby's point? Did the partisan influence raise any concerns in your research? I'll let Dr. Ishimaru answer that, since I've been kind of harping on Dr. Irby.
I think one of the things that has become very clear in the last couple of years, there used to be this idea that schools were a little bit outside of the political realm. And I think that we no longer are arguing, that school and schooling is always tied up in politics, and there are always political dimensions to school and schooling. So, I think that's one of the things that we know. I think in an earlier time, many scholars were feeling like they were trying to make that more visible, and it's very visible right now. I think there are ways in which the different the school districts that we studied. So after that initial round of really trying to understand what the folks in these more formal roles were doing, we realized that it wasn't only about what those individuals were doing, that there was equity leadership that was happening across systems, spread across multiple people. And one of the things that is a kind of shortcoming of a lot of the work that's happened out there is that it's often very short, very episodic. We get a kind of snapshot in a given moment, and maybe it lasts 6 months, maybe it's 9 months. And we thought, you know what, I think we need a longer view of when we think about things as deeply entrenched and historically rooted as the kind of inequities for different, for different student populations. Just a snapshot at any given moment doesn't really tell us very much. So we undertook, with the support of the Spencer Foundation, longitudinal study, in particular of 3 different districts. And I think one of the things that they were, as Dr. Irby said, a lot of them, they were disproportionately in these sort of bluer contexts politically. But I do think that some of the context of the specifics of those particular cities, and especially the suburban communities, were where we saw very small departments, or sometimes a one-person office, of really trying to lead change, and the kind of complexity and challenges that those folks face, not just, as evening fell, but from the very beginning. So we had especially Black women who were in the vanguard in many of these systems. But I think that the thing that we kind of saw that was kind of a difference, or striking, was kind of between more the sort of large urban and these smaller suburban communities. And there we have a chapter in the book. It's called "Shock to the System." Shannon Page Clark wrote, and it's kind of about a number of different contexts, but really what it means to for them to have these the small group of especially Black women who are trying to make substantive change. And there's a story in there about there's a truck parked right in the parking lot with a big old Confederate flag on it, and this kind of recognition of the researcher saying, well, what about that truck with the flag on it that you have to pass every day as you come into the district office? And the leader saying, I hadn't even consciously been thinking about that. It's like there are so many things like that happening all the time. The just sort of the ongoing challenges of what it means for these folks to try to do this work.
Yeah, and to follow up, since you brought up the Confederate flag, I do want to emphasize the complications that come from political opposition to the work you're describing here. For example, the Tea Party backlash that I mentioned earlier, in reaction to the Obama administration's attempts to really enforce, how would I say this? Enforce basically equitable treatment in the school systems, looking for disparities and trying to resolve them as quickly as possible. In terms of the long-term opposition to equity work, what were some of the responses that you received when you were doing this research? What were some of the ways in which you tried to account for those, not only in interacting with your larger project, but also interacting with the writers that you emphasize in this book? I'll let Dr. Ishimaru answer first, and then Dr. Irby, you can answer next.
So you have to kind of put ourselves back in this time frame. So as we think about like the other piece, in addition to actually Trayvon Martin was kind of like the beginning of this. The Obama administration issued a Dear Colleague letter, as you said, to get districts to put them on notice that they had these discipline disproportionalities that they needed to address. And so it's so I don't know. Ironic, of course, that then right as we're publishing this book, we've got a new Dear Colleague letter that comes out from the Trump administration. But during this time frame, like in the morning time, there was really a lot of scrambling and people just trying to figure out what is it that we're supposed to do. And so that, there was I think a sense from the institutional side that there is now a kind of legal motivation that we need to address these kinds of things. And so that the pushback, at least in the districts that we studied, hadn't yet really become very visible in terms of the broader conversation, the broader school boards and, the conversations that folks were having. It was when we got into then after 2020, the killing of George Floyd, we're still mid-pandemic at that point. that's when there was just an outpouring, and all of these organizations had this sense of urgency. There were actually resources flowing towards this work. And that's also like at a certain sense, there were like the pushback that just was continuing to grow across this time. And so that's when we got into, we've got school board meetings that are getting taken over. We've got people, we've got Moms for Liberty shutting down, sort of going out with these book bans. And then trying to, change the way that history is being taught. So it was kind of, what I would say is that, it was a kind of this steady presence in those earlier times, but then the broader energies and sense of institutional commitments, those are the things that really began to get reshaped as the pushback grew in power. Now, of course, we have a situation in which the federal government, our own government now, is in attack mode.
Yeah, and I think one of the things. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Irby.
No, go right ahead.
Oh, I appreciate it. So I just want to note one thing here. I'm unfortunately close to one of the groups that is rather active in Illinois, or was. They're not as influential now in the state of Illinois. Dr. Irby might actually be somewhat familiar with them. It's called Awake Illinois. They started out as an anti-mask operating unit, and then once they realized that wasn't as big of a political force, they started as an anti-LGBTQ group that is unfortunately based out of my hometown. And I've sparred a little bit with their founder once or twice online, as everybody should, in my opinion. But to Dr. Irby, I do think the thing that is especially poignant, and I know that a lot of your work has focused on the importance of Black youth, is the denigration from the opposition of Black youth and Black Americans in general, and any attempts to rectify inequality in education. So to add to the question I gave to Dr. Ishimaru, how did that influence your response while working with Dr. Ishimaru and all the other scholars that were working to make this book happen?
Yeah, I think that we really center kind of like anti-Blackness in our analysis. I mean, it's a really important piece, right? White supremacy, generally, anti-Blackness, kind of specifically, are things that we focus on, and we understand, how that threads through all of these different periods. So as Ann mentioned, there's this kind of like concept of like mourning, where people are doing a particular kind of work, policy, framing issues, thinking about data. Then these midday period where there's like a proliferation of resources, commitments. This is where we see the equity statements. And then we move into like this evening period where people are a little cautious. They're worried about their financial bottom line. Now we're at a point where school boards have turned over and are more conservative leaning, and so on and so forth. But underneath, throughout, what we know throughout is that there's always been this sentiment, this conservative sentiment throughout. So whether we could name them, like you mentioned, some groups. We could also think about, when people profess Black Lives Matters, then we saw Blue Lives Matter, right? So there's all of these different kind of seemingly, the anti-critical race theory, the specificity, that there's these seemingly kind of like disparate kind of things happening, but it's all part of a common kind of undercurrent where people have these kind of words and ways of speaking to one another. And actually what we saw with the culmination of, the second election of Donald Trump was really all of these kind of common interests coming together, to form, MAGA movement, which has a bunch of pieces to it, right? Like gun lobbyists, gun advocates, gun right lobbyists, anti-LGBTQ. If we can trace birtherism to the anti-immigrant sentiments that we see now. And so, one of the things that I will say, and we didn't deal with this really specifically throughout the entire text, but we kind of acknowledge, especially in introduction, that all of these kind of different movements were really kind of working, kind of like not totally coordinated, but it's culminated to a kind of like very kind of coordinated, organized effort, and it falls under kind of like, MAGA movement for the most part, right? Where all of these different kinds of anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQI, anti-gun rights for people who aren't white, right? Like all of these things have culminated into this very powerful kind of message that is MAGA, right? Which we didn't have in that kind of organized way, even if we think about, Trump administration #1. You had some people saying build that wall. That was, anti-immigrant sentiment, and it's just like come to a head in a different kind of way, and it's organized in a different kind of way now, and also resourced, and as Ann mentioned, supported by the federal government. So even if we had, for example, we don't even have to, it doesn't even have to be a political example. We saw people in Minnesota be shot down. We had people who were shot here in Illinois, and this administration's initial response was to paint those people as terrorists, as people who, basically deserve to be killed without asking any questions, without doing any kind of investigation, and actually even in an unprecedented move, keeping states from actually being involved in doing their own investigation and withholding evidence and that sort of thing. So I do think we're in a new moment where the sentiments aren't necessarily new, but they're organized in a way that I don't know that, you mentioned Tea Party. I think that was one kind of organization, but I think that it's really solidified and organized in a way that I think many people didn't necessarily anticipate. I anticipated it because I grew up in South Carolina. You know what I mean? But I think it's in different parts of the countries. And when I go back home, I always like to tell people this, that the power, if you go back and look at the pictures and the images from January 6th, assault on, the Capitol, there were American flags and there were Trump flags. Now, Black people, we had Barack Obama t-shirts. Like, you never seen. We had the t-shirts. This is the only president that I have known in the United States history to actually have people flying flags with the president's name, with Trump's name. And those flags fly all throughout the South, all throughout rural areas, all throughout South Carolina. So when I go, I see American flags, Confederate flags, South Carolina flag, and Trump flags.
Yeah, and I'll just name it as it is. In my opinion, we're facing a fascist moment, and education is another part of that battleground. And a lot of the dehumanizing rhetoric you describe has, in one way, shape, or form, been targeted to groups that the administration or the MAGA movement more generally views as not having power or having no means to defend themselves, even as opposition to this dehumanization continues, as it has since the inception of the country. But to get onto the dehumanization of the LGBTQ community that you mentioned, one of the things that comes up in the book is that a lot of LGBTQIA people are more likely to suffer from high levels of anxiety, depression, absenteeism in schools, and with states like Florida and Ron DeSantis and the Don't Say Gay bill, there seems to be a state incentivized approach that really incentivizes aggression and making those problems worse. So for people on the ground who are really trying to help these students and really trying to make sure the environment around them prevents these situations from getting worse, what role does equity leadership play? How does this really influence and protect students' livelihoods? And when it comes to parental rights, because the Don't Say Gay bill really emphasizes that, how do you respond when the potential abuser or oppressor, in this case, is actually the parent who wants to suppress their child's identity?
Yeah, those are really complex, hard questions. Well, I guess I will. I actually had a chance to be in Florida probably a year and a half ago, something like that. And I spoke to a teacher who was doing a lot of organizing and work in support of LGBTQ plus students. And I asked him, like, what keeps you going in this environment? And he said, like, these are my students. This is what it means to be an educator, to be a teacher. The kind of, when I have these relationships with students and I see them being harmed, that it's part of my job as an educator to stand up for them. And so I think that's one of the things that I think that I've been thinking about a lot as people have asked this question. As I said, like as we like over the years, as we developed this body of work and as we partnered with these different practitioners in making sense of the work that they were doing, near the end, one of the things that one of the chapters we came to was this one about there was a group of Black women principals who realized, you know what, they were kind of dissatisfied with what was happening at the district level, and they realized that they needed to take on the kind of systems equity leadership work. They hadn't been charged with it. They didn't get any, they weren't given any role. Nobody told them they could do it, but they decided that they needed to take that up because they were educators, because they were community members, because they cared for the young people in their schools and in their charge. And so I think that's a kind of powerful idea to me, even in these places that are very hostile, is that educators can take up that kind of leadership in whatever context they're in. In this case, this was a teacher trying to do some state level work. But really being grounded in trying to support young people in being themselves and being well. So the conversation with parents is also another very complicated one because, I think some of my other work has to do with the role of families. And I guess one thing that I just would offer is that we also think about that we think about families. On the one hand, getting much more clear, much more explicit about which families we're talking about at any given moment. It's not all families. But then also thinking about the kind of important that family of the heart play. In this case, I think even that educator I was talking to, probably the young person might think of him as kind of a family of the heart, an uncle in that sense. And that there are also chosen family who play a really crucial role in young people's lives. And so some of the trying to tease apart some of those distinctions becomes really important for actually focusing on young people and what they need to be well.
Yeah.
And Dr. Irby, if you'd like to.
Yeah, I think I would add in terms of like what can people do is, we're in a moment right now. I believe it's a moment. I think it's going to last a little while, but it is a moment. We have to, I think as part of this moment, we have to make sure we are committed to maintaining public institutions. Public institutions and institutions of higher education are going to be places where young people can actually develop, grow, learn outside of the context of their nuclear families and communities. And that's for everybody. And I think that's, if we look historically, that's important. I mean, if we think about like the civil rights movement, Black parents, many Black families during the civil rights movement they didn't tell their kids, they didn't encourage their kids to go out and march or do any of those things, right? Those young people learned and understood the importance of doing that primarily because they were a part of public institutions that they were fighting for access to public institutions, and public institutions have been really important. If we think about who sat down at lunch, those were college students, right? Right now, we see the federal government attacking higher education funding, public school education funding, not all school education funding, but in states like Texas, they're really trying to really erode the existence of public schools to make it be vouchers. If you have vouchers, you're going to have young people going into private settings that do have a particular kind of religious ideology that a public school doesn't necessarily have or doesn't necessarily have to adhere to. So I just think one of the things that we need to be mindful of is we have public institutions that we need to protect, that we need to fight for, that we need to advocate for more resources for, because we have to, with this kind of, this neoconservative administration and the kind of like neoconservative and neoliberalism that is happening, people want to privatize these public goods. I mean, even think about things like public libraries. The public libraries are important. There's all kinds of programming for gender nonconforming, LGBTQIA, racial, ethnic. That was the place where you could get access to information and programming for people who otherwise, if we left it up to religious institutions, or if we left it up to people's home, families and communities, they wouldn't get access to a lot of the information that we have access to. When I go to the library here, and when I'm a big advocate of libraries. Me and my colleague, met at a library the other day. I'm like, let's meet at the library. That's where you got people who are unhoused, who experience all kind of insecurities, right? They're using the restroom facilities there. You got a lot of trans people in the libraries. Like, these are places where people can actually go. They're a public institution that most cities are committed to maintaining because they're a public good. Same thing for parks, right? If we privatize everything, there's going to be some places people can't go into. But we should also think about parks, schools, and schools become one of those public places that I feel like we really need to fight for, because they're a place where people can form community, get a sense of who they are, read, study, learn, and form communities that otherwise would be stamped out if we didn't have public spaces.
And I would also add to that, I think one of the things that has been especially concerning to me, especially in the dehumanization of LGBTQ people, is this presumption that educators are groomers or are engaging in propaganda. There's always been, I think, for the last 30 or 40 years, an anti-intellectual undercurrent to the right that views any academic inquiry into injustice, any critical lens of the United States or the institutions that have been previously valorized as an inherently negative thing or incorrect and illegitimate. But the other side of this, and I know it was mentioned, I believe it was mentioned in passing, the other side of this is the presupposition of misogynistic perceptions onto academic inquiry, like the influence of seeing academia, especially women in academia, as inherently illegitimate. And Dr. Ishimaru, to what extent has the right-wing really propaganda environment and really the larger opposition to equity work not only impacted your work in this book, but in the larger discussions of trying to make education more fair and accessible to everyday people?
Yeah, I think it's profoundly affected it in so many different ways. Like I got doxxed, a couple of weeks ago, and so it's just the language and understanding of what the work of equity is about. Even though the word equity, right, has become so loaded, and I think Dr. Irby and I had a conversation with Dr. Keisha Scarlett, who is another author in the book, recently about these calculations that everybody is engaged in, no matter what your context is. There are some places where it's not a calculation; it's already done. But there are in many places, even very progressive spaces, like I'm at the University of Washington. There's a lot of jockeying around language and what people can and can't say, how it will be interpreted. And, I think that in the places where we can actually continue to do the work, even I think one of the dynamics that we have to watch out for is this kind of hollowing out, where there are institutions that say, we're still very committed to all these things. And at the same time, all of the resources, the infrastructure, the roles, all of those things are getting pulled when in the face of budget cuts, in the face of, like high stakes decisions to preserve the institution. And I think many, both universities and K-12 educational systems, even in very progressive contexts, are navigating those waters right now. So I think it has certainly made it far more challenging to use some of the language that we've used in the past. And I know like the political sphere is not a place often where we can ask for nuance, for complexity, but that's a lot of what my work is about. And so that's also been very challenging to be able to narrate some of the tensions that are inherent in some of the work. Like just like one of the early chapters is by Dr. Latish Reed, and she talks about some of the tensions that are unfolding as she's trying to advocate for LGBTQ plus inclusion policy. And there are folks who think that if she's doing equity work at the time, she should only be focused on Black students and their well-being. So that there are all these internal tensions that are very real, that are really important for us to dig into. And that has been one of the things that has been very challenging, and that has certainly impacted my ability to narrate that complexity and those tensions, is this broader political context in which there's a kind of hyper-vigilance, both on the part of those who say they're still advocates for equity, and on the part of folks who had always just changed the language, to kind of match whatever the moment was.
And I will say, like, just for a little bit of background on some of the work I've done. So for those who don't know, I know I've mentioned it in my bio on my website, but I have a master's degree in political science, and much of my work has been shaped by women, both in academia and also in the political environment. One of the last campaigns I was actually on was for State Senator Laura Ellman's campaign during the petition season leading up to the primary. But before that, I also worked for Elizabeth Warren. And so when I was pursuing my comprehensive exam, one of the things I actually started to look at was the role in which sexism impacted the way in which we talk about representation, how it impacts women running for public office, and also how it really impacts even the research itself. Like I found one study that was conducted in the 80s on this topic, and even in a paper that was presumably intending to rectify these problems, there was this presumption of the challenges that women were facing in terms of the home as like domestic work being inherently apolitical in their analysis. Anybody who literally has to deal with the price of goods, the price of coffee or food, knows that that is a public concern. That is an inherently political concern. But to add to your point, I think one of the things that is especially concerning is the role of the president in reinforcing these narratives. Donald Trump has repeatedly used sexist and dehumanizing language, not just about women in general, but against Black women in particular. So what role does misogynoir, the state, and really the overarching anti-intellectual element of the right, and really America as a whole, harm and make equity leadership and equity work more difficult?
Maybe I can start with talking a little bit about, because you talked about especially Black women, and so we have one of the chapters is really talking about this organizational paradox. On the one hand, of just having folks who are hired by positions to disrupt the status quo, but on the other hand, to also note that especially Black women and other women of color are facing constant pushback and undermining of how their leadership is being perceived and assessed. And so the short version of the story is, like a white man might say, like ask questions, right, about a particular community, and say, to what extent is a principal really serving that particular community? And people would all say, oh, that's what a great leader. He's very passionate. He really get down to it. And then these leaders would say, a woman of color would say the same thing, and she would be seen as scary, or too overbearing, or too emotional. So on the one hand, it's to say, like, these dynamics have existed all along. It's nothing new. And these leaders are facing that. It kind of amps up as they're trying to take on these formal roles to dismantle inequity. Then you add on this kind of the federal love, the narratives coming out, not just from the president, but from other politicians. And there's this constant narrative that is doubling down on all that. It's emboldening all of the dynamics that already existed.
Yeah. I it shows up in every way possible. And we found this in research, talking to the many people who co-authored chapters and who were the people who have been doing the work of equity leadership. I think one thing I want to point out is that disproportionately the leadership that we are writing about in the book has been led, organized, conceptualized, created by Black women and other women of color. One of the things that we note is they were doing this work before it was formally recognized. They did it while it was being formally recognized, and they continue to do it now that it's under attack. And I will say that the ways that this kind of like misogynoir really shows up, that this was the group that was first fired. Black women were just losing their jobs left and right, having created all of these tremendous benefits over this period of time that we write about in the book. But yeah, they were just under attack. Everything from death threats to microaggressions and disrespect, as Ann was mentioning, but also inadequate resources, being given tasks, responsibilities, and roles to do with inadequate resources, despite in our research us finding that people who were in similar positions who were men had less education. So now we're getting to, they had less educational credentials. The Black women in our study were the most highly educated, had the most educational credentials, but were given the fewest resources, and oftentimes even given the least amount of positional authority within the school systems they were working in. So while men came in and they thought about themselves and they taught about themselves as having a high level of autonomy, and they were like innovators, they used language of innovation and creation. And then Black women were given like a specialist position off in the corner in this small office and given no resources. So it was just to see the huge difference in how women who were highly educated, had been doing the work, did the work brilliantly and with tremendous courage and creativity, were treated. And it's not that their male peers weren't creative and courageous, is that, they moved from, for example, like the nonprofit world into a school, or they may have not had the educational credentials that many of the women had. And sometimes, even though they didn't have those credentials, the resources they were given, the amount of benefit of the doubt they were given, the respect they were given, allowed them to move the work forward in ways that a lot of the women in our research project described not necessarily being able to do, because of all of these forces working against them, despite all of the experiential and knowledge that they brought to their work.
Yeah, and I just want to also add to that, just to kind of, I think it's important to also include like an interdisciplinary perspective here, because one of the things that I've encountered in my political science environment is that same undermining of women when running for public office. Women in the research that I found were actually more likely to run later in life, because from a young age they were treated differently, and they internalized that over time. But also, one of the things that is unfortunately under discussed is the fact that women win at the same rate as men in elections. They have to go further in order to get to that point. So a lot of the women candidates, I think the perfect example of this was the 2016 and 2024 elections. The results speak for themselves in how Kamala Harris and Secretary Clinton were treated in terms of what they were dealing with. Is that there is a certain undercurrent of people who, when we talk about these prejudices, they want to think about it in a way that is almost strategic, when in reality it's pulling back. Oh, we shouldn't run women candidates. Oh, we shouldn't discuss those certain terms. We're not going to talk about it this way. Insofar as how you've interacted with that kind of response, both internally in terms of staff in education institutions and in terms of the media response, how has that impacted not only the way you respond to criticism of your work, but also how does that really impact the state of American democracy and education as a whole? That was an open-ended question. I apologize for that. That was for whoever wanted to jump on it first.
Okay, yeah, try to answer it. I think I'm getting the question. It was kind of a comment that rolled into a question. So,
yes.
So I think there's one other thing that I kind of want to add, and that's so this kind of speaks to what you're talking about, like the the level of kind of like well, one thing that I wanted to mention was that one of the things related to what you're talking about is that there's a chapter in the book called The Fruits of Unsuccessful like leadership, right? And it was interesting because one of the things that happened is that early on in particular, a lot of, I think probably I almost want to say all of the women narrated the work that they've been doing as relatively inconsequential early on. This is when we were doing interviews with people. They were saying, you know, I've been putting forth all this effort. I've done these things. I've put forth these policies. I work with the board in these ways. And then they would say, I'm exhausted. I'm tired. And the work, unfortunately, didn't make a difference. One of the things that is unique about our book is because we looked over an extended period of time, we were actually able to document the ways that their work, even though they narrated as being inconsequential early on, was actually the fruits of it actually, and it started to blossom later as other people started to inherit the work that they did. So for example, you mentioned the LGBTQIA plus policy chapter that was written by Dr. Latish Reed. She was one of the people who wrote about this LGBTQIA policy, but she also, can look now and see all of the benefits of the policies that she didn't think were even going to be implemented, that weren't going to matter. And so that's stuff that she can look back at, but at the time didn't feel like it was going to, it made a difference. So I mention that because when you think about, I'm thinking about, I can't help but he's a son of Greenville, Jesse Jackson, who we just laid to rest this week. He ran for president, right? A lot of people like Eddie Murphy and every black comedian clown Jesse Jackson for decades. You know what I mean? Like he was a running joke. Like Jesse Jackson ran for president. Did he really think he was going to win? That was an ongoing narrative, but he planted the seed, the ideas. He created the print. This is the person who created the Rainbow Push Coalition at a time when we were coming out of the civil rights movement and black leaders thought we should be really focusing and doubling down on black issues. And he was the person who was like, actually create a Rainbow Coalition. We need to work with and we need to collaborate with, the Latino community, with Asians. That laid the ground for Harold Washington. Then we moved forward and so on. And this was the playbook that Barack Obama used, right? So even think about, Kamala Harris, if we think about, all of the women like Elizabeth Warren, right? They're planting the seeds for like my daughter, you know what I mean? Like, and we don't know how and when the fruit of those seeds being planted are actually going to start to sprout and blossom. But I think part of it is having this, my pastor at my church talks about that hope is really kind of like imagination. And so even though I might, or we may not have the hope / imagination, the young people who are coming behind or who saw this particular moment undoubtedly have a different kind of imagination and have the gift of time on their side in a way that someone who's 50 or 55 doesn't have. So, God willing, has a long lifetime runway. And so I think that those are the kind of things that I think are important. We continue to keep the story of, Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, right? Like, all of these folks, Kamala Harris, we got to keep their stories alive. And so when I talked about the importance of why we thought this book was significant in this particular era, was that we wanted to make sure these stories were kept alive. We wanted to make sure that we told the stories of predominantly the women, right? There's men who did this work too, but most of this was done by women. We want to document this work. We don't want it to be erased because this is all information that, in the future, young people, we're hoping, who are in education now, may one day pick up and be able to kind of like run with and build on.
Yeah, and just go ahead.
Go ahead. I just want to add, this is like, I think as we were like, I literally was drafting the conclusion on Inauguration Day, right? And so really trying to think about, like how do we make sense of this, and how does this speak to the current moment and this idea, and this notion that night is falling right now. And I think that's what Decoteau is talking about, is really putting the work of the last 10 years in a longer historical arc, right? And understanding that even in this moment right now, we're part of this much longer arc of history and of efforts to make our schools more just, of efforts to realize this whole idea of democracy, all of those things. And so, as you know, as this night has fallen, really trying to help people think about, what does it mean? What do we got? What do we have to do at night, right? We have to, hold on to the lessons of the prior day. We have to reflect on it. We have to strategize and think differently about how we're moving. That some of the places, like we said earlier, are going to be places where the work has to go underground. And then we think historically about, the cover of darkness as a context for continuing to, quote unquote, do the work, right? That the Underground Railroad happened under cover of darkness. And then other places, it's going to have to be a kind of beacon of light, but that there is going to be a new day ahead. And like Dr. Irby said, it's going to be a while, but folks are going to continue to do this work. It's rooted in these much longer histories of trying to, reshape the conditions and the possibilities, both for young people to be well, but also for schools to realize their promise of educating and enabling us to have a democratic society.
And I just want to kind of circle back to that defiance that you guys are talking about. I know, Dr. Ishimaru, you were recently doxxed, and that hostility is related to your work. Firstly, I want to say I'm sorry you're going through that. That's a horrible thing. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. But I would like to say, would like to know, how has, on a personal level, that opposition affected you? How have you taken the lessons from this book in the way that you approach your advocacy and your educational work? And also, for other people who are trying to do the same work, what advice would you give them if they find themselves in a similar situation?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, thank you. I appreciate acknowledging that the doxing, unfortunately, has been a dynamic that many, especially women of color scholars, experienced. I would say disproportionately women of color who do critical work have experienced. So I am by no means alone. Part of the lessons that I took from that, I think one is, really thinking about what does it mean to for a whole community to step forward and to really encourage everybody to take up their agency, their responsibility, their leadership, especially as we think about young people and protecting our children. And I think about what happened in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. I have a former student who's there, who's supporting her husband's families at her husband's high school. And she said, as horrible as it's been, one of the things that has been really profound is to realize how mobilized everyone is. It's the next door neighbor, the small business owner, the folks who are down the street that you've never spoken to in your, the whole time that you lived in the neighborhood. Suddenly everybody is stepping up, and there are all of these coordinated networks. And I've also been learning from educators in places like LA and Chicago, the kind of coordination and networks that have developed in those places has been actually really inspiring to me, in a sense, to recognize that even if you don't have children in the schools yourself, you are a neighbor in around a school. You might live near a school. You might be a business where kids come after school. And there are all of these different organizations and ways that all of us are connected to young people. And so I think the lesson for me really, and the kind of light in all of this, is to see the potential, but also to see how ready people are to step up. And to really think about community as a resource in these times that we haven't fully yet really catalyzed and mobilized in the way that we're seeing in some places. Unfortunately, it's the kind of all-out attack that's catalyzed that in places like Minnesota and Minneapolis. But it also is a light or a source of hope for me because I can see how many folks are willing to step up.
Yeah, and I would firstly like to again say my sincerest apologies that you're going through that, and I really do appreciate your strength in dealing with such an incredible environment with such tact. But Dr. Irby, seeing a colleague and a friend deal with such an environment, seeing other colleagues of yours who have to deal with this, especially in the South, how has being a witness to that kind of hostility, being a witness to that state-sponsored endorsement of this kind of activity, influence your reaction to it? How can more people who are trying to oppose such dehumanizing rhetoric learn not only from Dr. Ishimaru's example, but the work that you have been doing up until this point?
Yeah, now I was kind of smiling when you were asking that question because I always think about fights. You know, like I feel like I just encourage people to fight, be fighters. And I think part of it is to fight for people and for the ideals and the values. So I talked a little bit earlier about like, public spaces, right? That's something that I'm committed to always fighting for. You know, and when Ann was telling me about what was going on, like I was kind of ready to fight. I think so I think part of what I'm learning in this is the importance of understanding power and understanding that power can come from multiple different things. It can come from people and collectives, and there can be power in people. There's power in resources that you may have. There's power in words and what you say and what you're willing to say. There's also some power. You can also lose power by changing things that you feel compelled to say and talking about things in a way. You can give away your power by being silent. You can give away your power by not voting, right? You can be powerful by voting. I'm seeing the sign that you have behind you. So I think some of it is trying to figure out like how are you willing to fight? And whatever that way is that you're willing to fight, then do that. And I would also say, in addition to how are you willing to fight, like what fight is a little bit scary for you? That's the fight, right? That I feel like that's important. And what we've seen is that, and what we saw in our book were people who, what we started to call it like coloring outside the lines, people who fought for what they really believed in these systems. And it was almost always the instances when people did something a little bit outside of what the institution expected or wanted them to do is when we saw people actually get results and get change. So I think that it's not only a fight, it's fight in a way that the system typically would not want you to fight. So if you're a voter, yes, vote, but also get out and do something else. Like don't just vote this time, find a candidate you believe in and support that candidate by canvassing, by one of the things that I do is I do a lot of working with folks to raise money, right? So I teach people how to do grassroots fundraising, and we do call parties, right? And I really focus kind of like on the local level, like aldermen's races and those sorts of things. But so do something a little bit above and beyond what your normal fight is to just like kind of, just push yourself to kind of like, and I feel that if everybody does that, you fight your normal fight and you're willing to take on one new kind of way of exercising power to fight, I feel like that the cumulative kind of collective power that actually generates is pretty tremendous. That might be making a donation to a political candidate or to a cause that you're committed to. It might be doing a call party. It might be doing something other than just your regular kind of voting. Or if you've never voted before, your vote might be your way of fighting. You know what I mean? So I think, or it could be somebody running for something, right? The parent teacher organization, right? Join the PTO, run to be president of the PTO. In Chicago, we have local school councils. Participate in that. So I feel like if people can step outside of their kind of normal fight and take their fight up a level in a different kind of way, I think that's really important. And we know the thing that gives me hope about when people start to do that is it actually works. To have fought against the current administration, they get positive results, right? We saw that in Illinois. We saw it in Minnesota. We saw it in Illinois. We saw it in LA. We saw it in universities, right? Who said, no, we're gonna kind of fight, right? A lot of people aren't talking about January of 2026, the dear colleague letter that essentially threatened public schools and institutions of higher education to the thing that set in this kind of like this compliance with
The anti-DEI.
DEI. So right, the anti-DEI stuff, like that was the people fought it. Like the unions fought it.
Well, the Trump
ACLU
administration dropped their appeal.
They appeal, right? So I think part of the lesson that we know, we look historically, and if we look at what's happening right now, you got to fight. So I think that that's the important thing that I've been taking from this particular moment.
Well, wonderful. And I just have one last question, and I think to some extent you've already answered it a little bit, Dr. Irby, but I'll let you get to it in just a second. But seeing as how the midterms are coming up, and really there's been a lot of discussion of realizing for a lot of people that ultimately this administration is not only worse than it was the first time around, but is even more overt about its dehumanizing and anti-egalitarian work. What is one message you like to give to people watching this, to Americans more generally, and to the people who are working in education to try and make this a more just and more fair country? Dr. Ishimaru, you can go first, and then Dr. Irby, you can finish us off.
Yeah, I just like, again, putting it in this broader historical context. I'm Japanese American. I'm fourth generation. My father was born and went in incarceration camps during World War II, and we're repeating all of those old plays right now. And so I think that yes, vote, yes, do those things. And I think, like Tressie McMillan Cotton said, I think we all get overwhelmed by all the terrible news all the time. And the reaction sometimes is to shut down, right? Because we get overwhelmed. And I think the antidote, though, and this is what she was saying, is that the antidote to that, though, is to get active. Timothy Snyder, the guy, the Don't Bow in Advance guy, says, like, get your body in unfamiliar places with unfamiliar people. And that as Dakota's saying, like, fight, do the voting, and actually be in community.
And Dr. Irby, I'll leave you with the last word.
I guess mine is very similar, right? I mean, I always use this phrase, stay in the struggle, right? Without struggle, without effort, there's no progress. So I feel that, I always, sometimes when we do book signings, I'll write, this tagline, thank you for, purchasing our book. And I'll say, stay in the struggle. And I feel like that, sometimes you just got to figure out how to keep going.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time. It's been a long time coming, and I'm really glad we were able to get this done. For any of you who would like to check out their material, they will have their bios in the description of this video once I repost the VOD on my channel. And I will also be doing a write-up on my website, progressiveamerican.net. Thank you so much, professors. I really do appreciate your time. You have a